Well, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are joining today. I'm here on behalf of the Online Events Committee. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's event. I'm Fernanda Rebelato. I'm a Brazilian researcher at the New School, and I'm a young scholar member of IAFFE, as well as a member of the Online Events Committee. So I'm here just to set up some reminders to you all. Today's event will be recorded and posted on IAFFE's YouTube channel, and previous events in that series are available on the channel as well. We also have online events in other event tracks, so please keep an eye out for more information regarding those. Another reminder for you all, this is a Zoom meeting, it's not a webinar, so please keep yourself muted. We will get to questions and participation in the later part of the event. We invite you to post questions and comments and resources, whatever you want to share in the chat section throughout the event. And in the end, the moderator, Professor Mezzadri, will be getting the questions in the chat, but also you can raise your hand to participate with all of us. So just to introduce a little bit, this is a fireside chat. It's a conversation with Ayşe Arslan, winner of the Agarwal Book Prize 2025, and Kanchana Ruwanpura with Alessandra Mezzadri as the chair and moderator of this conversation. In here, we'll discuss their books, Women's Productive and Reproductive Labour, Class and Gender Inequalities in Turkey, and Garments Without Guilt, Global Labour Justice and Ethical Codes in Sri Lankan Apparels. Just a little context, the Suraj and Shyama Devi Agarwal Book Prize was established by Bina Agarwal. The prize is a testament to the enduring legacy of Binan's parents and their commitment to promoting gender equality in the global economy. The Agarwal Book Prize acknowledges books that showcase original avenues in theory, methodology, empirical analysis, and policy with regard to any facet of gender and the economy. Nominations for the 2027 Agarwal Book Prizes are open until May 30. So we warmly invite you to submit eligible books. Please take a look on more information. We'll share the form and the website in the chat. So with no last but not least, let's say, we're delighted to have with us today as moderator, Professor Alessandra Mezzadri. She's the Professor of Global Development and Political Economy at SOAS in the Department of Development Studies. Her research focuses on global industrial circuits, labor informalization, and labor regimes, sweatshops in the global economy, global labor standards, and critical approaches to CSR, ethical consumerism and modern slavery, feminisms in development and social reproduction approaches, and the political economy of global India. He is the author of The Sweatshop Regime, Laboring Bodies, Exploitation, and Garments Made in India, the lead author of The Social Life of Industrial Disputes, and the editor of Marx and the Feud, as well as the co-editor of the Handbook of Research of the Global Political Economy of Work. So, Professor Mezzadri, please take it away.
Thank you so much for the very kind introduction, Fernanda. Hello, everyone, and let me say how happy I am to moderate what promised to be a great discussion that involved two great feminist scholars that focus on the global garment industry, and that produced two fantastic books on respectively Sri Lanka and Turkey. And the first book on Sri Lanka by Kanchana looks at its ethical garment industry and how it relies still on unequal labor conditions, and he argues then how global labor standards alone cannot ensure justice, while instead workers' experiences are primarily shaped by local social and political dynamics. While Ayşe's book on Turkey instead highlights how women's paid factory work is tied to unpaid domestic contributions, and he argues then that when we look at inequality, we need to understand it as produced across workplaces and households, not just in a sphere alone. So I think they complement each other very well. It is such a pleasure and honor also to have this discussion in the eve of the anniversary of the Rana Plaza disaster. The Rana Plaza disaster took place on the 24th of April 2013, claiming the lives of over 1,500 garment workers and injuring 2,000 more. We remember them during the entire week, and especially today and tomorrow, and it's a great way to have this event to do so. But now let me introduce properly my two very distinguished colleagues. Dr. Ayşe Arslan is the Alexander von Humboldt Research Fellow at Humboldt University in Berlin and a lecturer at Hacettepe University. Her doctoral thesis was awarded the 2020 British Society for Middle Eastern Studies Leigh Douglas Memorial Prize and the 2019 Turkish Social Science Association Young Social Scientist Award. And of course, it's we know that the book that came out of that then won the Agarwal Book Prize. Her research interests include gender, class, social reproduction, labor organization, everyday life, and the political economy of Turkey. And she has published journal articles and book chapters on all these topics alongside her book in both English and Turkish. Professor Kanchana Ruwanpura is a professor of development geography at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden and a fellow at the Center for South Asian Studies, University of Edinburgh, Scotland. She has a PhD from the University of Cambridge, where she has published widely on feminist topics in various journals, well, in multiple journals, and her books include open access volumes Protecting Workers, Crisis COVID-19 and South Asia, 2026, with Wilfred Swenden, Routledge Handbook of Contemporary Sri Lanka in 2025 with Amjad Salim, and monographs and edited volumes, Garment Without Guilt, that she will focus on today, Labor Justice and Ethical Codes in the Sri Lankan Apparel. Besides this, she also has a handbook with Elgar and with Shirlena Huang, and Matrilineal Communities, Patriarchal Realities, 2004 with Michigan University Press. Let me now get to the core of our discussion, starting off with the first question. And I think the first question is very appropriate for us talking about Rana Plaza and poor labor standards in the industry this week. So it will focus specifically on codes of conduct. So since the 1990s, we know that brands have increasingly relied on codes of conduct and ethical trade initiatives in the garment industry to regulate labor conditions in the supply chain. And while these mechanisms are presented as tools to improve these conditions, they also point at many contradictions, and I think the disaster, in fact, speak to those. How do you assess the importance and limits of these voluntaristic regulations in shaping labor relations in the garment sector? It's a question for both, but I will start with Kanchana. Thank you.
Thank you, Alessandra, and thank you to the IAFFE staff first for helping us host this event, to all of you who are here. Super appreciate it, and it's also it is really a coincidence that it's coinciding with the Rana Plaza, but I think it's an appropriate one. So thank you, Alessandra, for chairing it and for that question. I think it's a great question to reflect on why Rana Plaza happened and how it kind of matters all over the world in a sense. So in the book, what I argue is, although there are these voluntary codes of conduct which is supposed to be regulating the garment industry, not just the garment industry, different kind of sectors globally. What I found in Sri Lanka, and this I think probably matters everywhere else, the ways in which these codes touch down in a country really is contingent upon ground level factors. So whether it's legislation, whether it's the levels of social development in a country, whatever forms of social welfare regimes you get in the global south, for instance, right? And one of the reasons I was motivated to write the book was because I found at the time I started this research, which was in 2008, you had many kind of, dismal stories. Rana Plaza was really the apex in a sense, but you had things like factory fires in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, child labor in India especially, And Sri Lanka tended to avoid this kind of negative spotlight. In fact, it avoided that negative spotlight till the pandemic happened. And I was curious to know how is it that Sri Lanka is able to do this? Is it the codes on their own that makes a difference? Or whether it's the interaction of the codes and the local ground conditions? And this is what I was trying to bring out from the book. And so you actually see, so there are certain areas, for instance, actually child labor is the easiest one, because Sri Lanka has universal access to education, and education is compulsory till you're 16 years of age. The code on no use of child labor is pretty easy to implement in Sri Lanka. So most factories in Sri Lanka don't use child labor for this reason, right? Because the legislation in the country, the social provision in the country prevents this from happening in the first place, right? In contrast, you take something like living wage. Most countries, including Sri Lanka, it doesn't exist. And part of this is because of the very weak bargaining power of unions in the country, and the fact that workers themselves don't have a lot of say on their wages. So living wages is one of the areas, even though Sri Lanka claims to be producing garments without guilt, this is their kind of slogan of the Joint Apparel Associations Forum. Living wages are often non-existent, but this is one of the codes that's supposed to be upheld according to the code regimes, right? So the voluntary codes are at one level kind of it's a loose architecture, but the application of it and the efficacy of it really depends on what one gets, the ground condition, the social conditions within the country, the legislative frameworks within the country. And that's what I was hoping to unpick in the case of the Sri Lankan garment sector, and how these kind of contradictions brings with it different kind of labor dynamics and gender dynamics on the shop floor itself. So I think I'm given just about 5 minutes, and I think I may have used it up. So I'm handing over to Ayşe now.
Yes, please. Thank you. You've been extremely disciplined. Ayşe, do you want to reflect on the role of codes in Turkey?
I would like to first thank everyone from IAFFE staff who are involved in organizing this event. I'm very happy to be part of this talk. With regards to ethical trading, actually, it's not one of the most emphasized strands of the Turkish garment industry, but codes of conduct are, of course, important tools for improving working conditions to some degree. They are one of the reasons why labor regimes, for example, in exporting factories are relatively more compliant with the national labor law and international labor standards compared to small-scale sweatshops, which are not audited. All the garment factories that I visited during my fieldwork, including the one that I worked, were subject to social compliance audits by independent international organizations. And these audits have been effective in ensuring, for example, registered employment, regular and full payment of wages, the provision of social security, and the absence of child labor. But these are the bare minimum requirements of labor regulations, and they're relatively easy to monitor, and factories are generally expected to comply with them. But of course, labor informality and labor justice extend beyond these conditions, and even in audited factories, working conditions often fall short of national and international standards. Labor rights continue to be violated, and informality persists in different scales and forms, and I would like to mention some of them. For example, overtime work is the norm rather than the exception in most garment factories in Turkey. Although it is illegal, workers are often forced to work overtime, and refusal is not a real option. Another major issue is workers' access to sick leave and paid annual leave. Workers often refrain from asking for sick leave, even if they're seriously ill, or from taking their annual leave, because they know such requests are unlikely to be granted. And if they insist, they risk being threatened with dismissal or directly being dismissed. Moreover, older factory workers typically have formal contracts. Wages remain very low, usually around the legal minimum. And when monthly earnings increase due to excessive overtime, employers often underreport wages in order to reduce their social security contributions. And as a result, workers receive lower severance pay and pensions due to these underreported incomes and reduced monthly premiums. Also, we know that labor informality is not limited to material working conditions and legal rights. It also encompasses intense work pressure and strict labor control, to which those factory workers are particularly exposed. Due to the rigid division of labor, workers perform highly repetitive tasks on assembly lines under constant pressure to meet production targets, under the surveillance of supervisors, and with the ongoing threat of job loss due to low performance. In this sense, factory labor regimes are usually more oppressive than other forms of production because managerial control is stronger and workplace discipline more rigid. So I argue in the book that to understand the persistence of these forms of informality, despite the presence of codes of conduct, we need to look at the broader structure of the neoliberal labor regime. This regime is based on extracting maximum surplus value from workers at minimum cost. And it is in fact imposed by the very same international brands that require their suppliers to adopt codes of conduct. So, addressing labor rights violations and labor injustice requires a class-based and internationalist approach. Most importantly, it is essential to create the conditions that enable workers to organize and lead social change in their own interest, and codes of conduct are usually ineffective for creating such conditions. Kanchana, in fact, explores on this aspect of codes of conduct in her book, like very well. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Ayşe. I'm just continuing with you with the second question, because in your book, you, of course, focus on the shop floor, but also carefully examine the different ways in which women's reproductive lives are incorporated into their experience of work. So it shapes also the ways in which their working lives actually are structured and lived. So in a sense, if you could elaborate more on how this relationship shapes itself, that'll be very interesting for us. How these dual responsibilities that women have as paid productive as well as unpaid reproductive workers shape their experience of the shop floor and the vulnerability that come out from the shop floor. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this is the main research question of my book. My book examines how women's productive and reproductive work interact with each other and how they co-constitute each other. So in the book, I show that labor regimes and the conditions of women's paid work cannot be adequately understood without looking at their reproductive work within the family. And this reciprocal relationship manifests itself in various ways in women's lives. First of all, there is a highly unequal gender division of labor within the households of women garment workers. It is women who carry the primary and often sole responsibility for household chores. Of the 50 women that I interviewed, 18 said the men in their households never contributed to housework, not even occasionally. Another 31 said the men help only in a very limited and conditional way. Similarly, mothers take on almost all responsibility for their children's physical, emotional, and developmental needs. And women workers' care work also includes caring for sick and elderly relatives, usually their own parents or parents-in-law. And as a result, like women's, there's like almost total responsibility for reproductive work in their families has profound implications for the conditions of their paid work. For example, childcare prevents many women, especially those with several children, from working outside the home. It is the main reason why home-based women workers cannot seek employment outside and instead have to endure working at home for very low wages until under entirely flexible conditions and without labor rights. And since there is no spatial or temporal separation between their productive and reproductive work, they effectively become both full-time housewives and garment workers. For women working in factories and sweatshops, reproductive labor limits their ability to engage in overtime work. When they are forced to do so, the burden on their shoulders increases and they feel more stressed and exhausted. If they refuse overtime, however, they earn less income and face more limited employment opportunities. As I said, overtime work is the norm in most garment workplaces. Care responsibilities also constrain women's standard working hours and thus make their paid work more precarious in this sense. Women who have no one to leave their young children with can often only work part-time and therefore they cannot access full labor rights. So overall, women workers' reproductive obligations severely limit their access to secure employment and reinforce the flexibilization and exploitation of their paid labor. In this way, the capitalist class maintains a large reserve army of labor whose work can be bought more cheaply, flexibly, and informally. But beyond its implications for paid labor conditions, I think it's also crucial to understand how women's productive and reproductive labor are intertwined at emotional and practical levels. The imposition of reproductive labor on women harms them not only economically, but also mentally and psychologically. Although it is disguised as free choice or like acts of love, women do the bulk of reproductive work in their family, usually not because they want to, but because they have to. They experience physical and emotional exhaustion and deep feelings of injustice, anger, unhappiness, and devaluation. And these are all stem from both the heavy burden of their reproductive responsibilities and also from the socio-material conditions under which this labor is performed. Therefore, my book argues that the exploitation and subordination of women in the productive and reproductive realms co-determine and stimulate each other. The socio-material conditions of women's productive and reproductive work are inherently linked and mutually constitutive. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Ayşe. Let's now take these processes back to the shop floor, because the shop floor itself is a highly gendered social formation. So now, starting with the Kanchana first, I would like to invite you to reflect on the gendered nature of the garment production process and the workplace that is structured. I would like to specifically ask you in which key ways we can say that the shop floor is gendered, also to give our auditors a sense of also what might be the difference between these two places that we were discussing. Kanchana.
Thanks, Alessandra. So some of what Ayşe said is like an important backdrop for understanding Sri Lanka as well. But as anyone who kind of looks at my book, I really focus primarily on the shop floor. But one of the things I was compelled to kind of revisit my own kind of frameworks that I took when I went onto the field, and I did my field work in two fairly well established big factories in Sri Lanka, was that the gendered nature of the shop floor wasn't necessarily one of only the neophyte or young women, young unmarried women who were on the shop floor. To start with, women, there were women across age groups, married, unmarried, etc., on the shop floor. But the shop floor was also gendered in very complex ways. So in the two factories I was at, in one factory, the women were primarily the seamstresses, so they were the ones who were working the line, although not only, there were also men there. So about 10 to 15% of Sri Lanka's garment factories, certainly in both these factories, were men. So there were also men who were doing the sewing, the the packaging, all these things that we don't really consider when we always think of the garment factory as one where you have only women, right? So in one factory, it was the men were the supervisors, and it was primarily women who were doing the line work, right? In the other factory, it was actually completely the reverse. Many of the middle-level management were women. The factory, the workers were both men and women. And I found the dynamics fairly complex in that it was not, one couldn't really tell an easy story that that women lacked agency, and they were always, that they were, I mean, yes, at one level, surplus extraction happens, and that's a forgiven, I mean, it's a given in a sense, right? But the ways in which it takes place and how workers, whether they were women or men, negotiated that shop floor was revealing of the gender dynamic. So in the shop floor where the women were middle managers, many of the men who were doing the sewing, and they had when I had interviews with me, they used to actually reveal this, that they used to find it very emasculating the way they were treated by the women who were middle managers. And I have to confess, some of the women middle managers were pretty harsh on all workers, but including the men, right? So the gender dynamics are a very complex stories. In the other factory I was at, the women used to, with the middle managers, they used to have to they would constantly be negotiating and coaxing. So over time in Sri Lanka, yes, most workers are compelled to do it, but the level of force is one of that's negotiation. So I was reminded of Michael Brevoy's work on negotiating consent, where middle managers have to really work on getting the consent of women workers before they could get them to do the overtime, right? And so in that sense, it was gendered, but this is where I think that social development, or whatever the ground conditions, really matter. So for people in the audience who are not very aware, Sri Lanka's social development indices are pretty high. There's a high level of social development, certainly. I mean, and there still is, even though we've gone through economic crisis, and all of this shaped the gender dynamic. So the women were highly educated women. Sometimes some of them, I used to come across university graduates who were working part-time or working full-time and studying part-time, even though they were full-time university graduates, right? So this gave them a level of negotiating powers that I had not read about in many of the books, ethnographies I had gone through, right? And this also mattered in terms of, kind of trying to theorize this. I kind of use a lot of Andrew Herrod's work, where he talks about how labor is also important in how the nature of capitalism evolves and the shape of capitalism itself, right? That dialectical relationship, we've got to be focusing on labor agency, and that gendered nature of labor agency really kind of varied. So and this was like, for me, it was a revelation, and I had to kind of re-examine my own kind of perceptions that I took to the factory floor when I was doing this research, right? It required me to think about how gender is about both men and women, and how masculinities are framed and reframed and contested on the shop floor is also an important one. I think I've taken 5 minutes, so I'm going to hand it over to
That's
Ayşe.
perfect as before. Ayşe, you want to add to that?
You're mute, Ayşe.
Yeah, sorry. Indeed, garment workplaces in Turkey are deeply gendered, and of course there are like very complex issues, layers of this gendered nature of the workplaces. But I will share some of the main general traits of this gendered characteristic. One key dimension is the gendered division of labor and hierarchy on the shop floor. For example, in factories, men's work is systematically paid more than women's work. Tasks such as ironing, cutting, warehousing, and shipping are performed almost exclusively by men, and they are better paid. In contrast, tasks such as trimming, quality control, packaging, and handwork are carried out by women, and these are among the lowest paid positions. In sweatshops, the gender division of labor is also evident in the allocation of reproductive tasks at work. Unlike factories, sweatshops usually don't employ staff for these tasks, and it is almost always women workers who serve lunch, make tea, clean toilets, wash dishes, and sweep and mop floors. And importantly, this labor is unpaid, and in this sense, women's productive work in the workplace is devalued in the same way as it is within the household. Again, I'm gonna talk about a bit like general characteristics of this gendered nature across all scales of production. For example, women tend to earn lower wages and have fewer opportunities for promotion than men. There are also serious labor rights violations related to pregnancy, maternity, and access to childcare facilities. Male workers are more readily granted leave, while women face greater risks of mistreatment by their supervisors, male colleagues, or employers. So, as a result, patriarchal norms that position women as inferior to men are actively reproduced within the garment workplaces. Another significant issue shaped by these norms is sexual harassment at workplaces. Among the 36 factory and sweatshop workers that I interviewed, 1/3 reported having experienced sexual harassment, and another third had witnessed or heard about such incidents. Yet, many women don't speak openly about these experiences, largely due to the fear of being stigmatized or getting a bad name. They usually feel helpless and hopeless about their ability to change the situation. Patriarchal norms also shape everyday social relations on the shop floor. To protect their reputations, women often keep male colleagues at a distance and they construct fictitious family relationships. For example, they frame interactions as sister-brother relations as a way to create safer and more socially acceptable boundaries. Patriarchal pressure is more intense on divorced or widow women workers, and the risk of being subjected to sexual harassment is usually higher for them. Closely related to this is the broader social stigma attached to the sector. There is a dominant negative image that portrays women garment workers as immoral or loose. And during my field work, many women spoke about how this stigma affected them and described it as one of the most difficult aspects of working in the industry. So overall, patriarchal norms shape not only labor processes and working conditions, but also the sociocultural environment and everyday life on the shop floor to the detriment of women. And my analysis shows that there is a co-constitutive relationship between patriarchal relations, norms, and production relations.
Thanks a lot. I was very interested about your answers to this question because, in a sense, you also suggest how the shop floor itself bears what are essentially different regimes of patriarchy, no? Using the words of Denise Candioti. So this emerges very much through processes of work itself. I'll focus now again on Sri Lanka, Kanchana. And the workforce in Sri Lanka is also layered in further complex ways because it's multi-ethnic in a country that has experienced prolonged periods of ethnicity-based political violence and conflict. So I do wonder how this history and the ethnic composition of the workforce then shapes also the everyday factory relations and intra-class dynamics among garment workers, and in a sense also how do management practices interact with these for the scope of labor control.
Thanks, Alessandra. So just in terms of the particular timing of my project. So it started my research on the garments factory. It started in 2008. 2009 was when Sri Lanka's, formally kind of ended 30 years of war. It was ended in a fairly bloodied way. But so in that process, in that time, I had started my research and continued it. The shop floor and the work, the kind of the makeup of it varied, right? So at the beginning, and especially in one factory, it was just primarily the dominant community, which is the Sinhala community. But this varied over time. And I also subsequently then did research in the North and the East, where there was a different story, which is North and the East is where the war was most pronounced, where there are ethnic minorities, right? In both these, actually, in fact, in many of these factories, even though Muslims are a minority community in Sri Lanka, there were hardly any, actually, I can't remember of any Muslims on the factory floor. So it was either Sinhala people or Tamil people, and Tamils who are either from the North and the East, or the Malaya Tamils who are from the central parts of the country. And at the beginning, it was a very fractious relationship, even though they were of a similar class background, right? The ethnic, this kind of the ethno-nationalist backdrop that had colored Sri Lanka for 30 years also ended up coloring the factory floor in one factory when workers from minority communities started to enter it, because interestingly, even though Sri Lanka's labor force participation rates are low, management constantly have a problem in recruiting workers, right? So they have to go to different parts, so spatially their recruiting strategies really varies, right? And so initially the fracture, it was really fractious. By the time I kind of did 10 years of field work, by the end of it, then some of the Sinhala workers, because I kept in touch with some of them, they came to this recognition, oh, we are all workers, really. It doesn't matter what our ethnic grouping was. And that was quite an interesting turn of events, but I think it also is linked to the economic crisis that happened afterwards, right? So by 2022, you have economic crisis where people in the country really come together irrespective of ethnicity. But at the beginning, again, going back to the North and East of the country, the recruiting strategies relied a lot on the Tamil minority communities who were coming out of a war, but the management were predominantly Sinhala, right? And there was no reflection on the part of senior management whether this was even an effective strategy. So there was a lot of tensions on those shop floors which were based in the North and the East of the country between, and Kim, he has done similar work of Chinese workers in Korea, right? Where there are these tensions between minorities in majoritarian countries, in this case, Sri Lanka. So the beginning was a situation, I would say, which is kind of similar to some of what Ayşe was talking about, where Tamil people in the North and the East were looking for work. They felt compelled to be in this kind of jobs. And yet they had to negotiate a workplace where the management was predominantly Sinhala, and there was no sense of consideration. And Sinhala management often thought that they were actually doing Tamil workers a favor by offering them jobs. And this was about kind of raising a belongingness that didn't recognize difference to start with, right? So that created a lot of tensions in the shop floor in the North and the East of the country. In the North and the East to date, it's predominantly Tamil workers. The management structures have changed over time. Some of the managers have actually started to learn Tamil, so that has made a difference. But the beginning was fractious and full of tension in a way that reflected, in a sense, in a way that reflected the national context within which workers were being absorbed into the shop floor, right? Into the supply chain, in fact, right? Do I have more time, or have I run out of time?
We're running up.
Okay, that's
up,
fine. No, I think I've given a flavor of what it was like, just to talk about that, to give a flavor of the kind of the ways in which the national landscape sometimes create possibilities. At other times they can be quite repressive for different groups of workers.
No, absolutely. And again, emerges this idea of the garment garment shop floor as really sort of encapsulating so many different social, economic, and political relations that then speak to the actual different regional political economy that we're looking at. I have a final question on methods. I have to ask you to be very disciplined and reduce your answers to a couple of minutes each, please. And trying to tease out the differences in the methodological approaches that you have highlighted. So I let you free to choose a couple of points each in relation to how you went about researching the garment sweatshop, and at the same time, how your positionality also shaped some of the choices that you made. You're both researchers that are just doing work within your country of origin. So how this shaped your choices is also something very interesting to share with our audience. Ayşe, you want to say a few words first, and then I conclude with Kanchana?
Yeah, sure. So I like to talk about the participant observation part of my research methodology. So I conducted an ethnographic extended case study over 14 months in Izmir. And as part of my participant observation, I worked at different scales of garment production for 6 months in total. And so this methodological approach allowed me to immerse myself in the world of women garment workers and to better understand the forms of exploitation and subordination that they experience both in production and within the family. I think that ethnographic work and participant observation are especially crucial to understand the complex, fragmented, and contradictory nature of the social reality. So it was very useful for my research in understanding this complexity. And with regard to my positionality, actually, the question of being an insider or outsider was central to my research because I chose Izmir as my field site was partly because I grew up there in a working class neighborhood where many garment factories and sweatshops are located, and my family was still living there, and I stayed in my childhood home during my field work. And the factory where I worked for 2 months was only a 10-minute walk away. And I already knew some of the women workers working at the factory from the neighborhood. And I had even attended primary school with some of my co-workers. But at the same time, I had left Izmir at the age of 18 for higher education, and I was doing a PhD in London during the research period. And in a sense that I was researching the life that they were living. And because I made my identity and purpose clear to all participants from the beginning, workers were aware of these differences. So in this sense, I occupied a position that was both insider and outsider, actually, as many researchers, because there is no position which is like fully one or the other.
Yeah, let me interrupt you here. Sorry, we're just trying to keep time for the questions. Let me get to Kanchana and ask her very briefly what is like a punchline on her research method, and then we move to the Q&A.
Yeah, I think, the punchline would be, because I did this research over a decade, or the research that led to the book over a decade, the punchline would be I had to vary my methods over time. So I started with ethnography, being at 2 factories day in, day out. But I was able to access them only by interviewing management first and gaining their trust. So trust was important, and it had to be negotiated all the time. It's not something I negotiated at the start and I could just let it lie. It wasn't. It was something that I had to negotiate all the time with the workers, with management. And, I was a Sri Lankan, but again, based outside. That in itself, led to different complexities. I did this research not in Colombo, which is where I had grown up. And then the other thing is that I also found that we have to be flexible with our methods, especially if you're doing long-term research over in this case, it was a decade. So I kind of also, my other punchline would be with the unbounded nature of our research methods, that we need to recognize that, draw in on different methods. So when I was doing research in the North and the East, it was really much more based on open-ended questionnaires, right? Open-ended questions with smaller groups of workers rather than the ethnographies that I did in the south of the country. So I guess that those would be the two punchlines. One is that accessing, the unbounded nature of research and how trust has to be negotiated throughout. It's not something you enter with and it works on its own, but you've got to kind of work on it throughout.
Absolutely. And also, if I compare your two cases, I mean, the methods you use are to an extent also substantially different. But to me, beyond the question of insider, outsider, I find it really interesting how the reproductive has shaped your own experience, right, in approaching the garment industry in different ways. So, when we talk about how these two dimensions as feminists, we need to address them both when we do research. Then in your case, I think this really is a very strong part of how the research came to be in considering who you were. Just thank you so much for these insights into your great books, which I invite our colleagues here to consult and read. And now I wonder if we do have questions, because it's a Q&A segment of the session.
Professor, there is one in the chat that I just sent to you. I think it's an interesting one.
Yes, and I see it's a question posed by Giseli, who I greet and say hello to. And it's a question about collective agency. So, Giseli, do you want to pose your question yourself? Because this is quite informal sort of interactions we're having. So if you're able to unmute yourself, that'll be better than me reading your words.
Sure. I'm very happy to hear these presentations. It sort of brings back memories of my field work from a long time ago on carpet weaving in Turkey. But I have a question about collective agency, and are the workers in either of these sets of factories you studied unionized, and if not, are there attempts to do so? And what is your perspective on the potential for collective agency? And I mean, I sort of come from this, you may, of course, be familiar with the prominent argument against union organizing, that these are essentially factories that are globally footloose, and low paying as these jobs are, they will be endangered by union organizing. So hence my question. Where are you?
I'm here. Shall I go?
Oh, sorry.
Shall I go quickly?
Yes, please. Let's go. And then in the meantime,
thank you for the question, and it's a good one. So Sri Lanka does have unionized factories, although the two factories I was at, well, both of them were not unionized, but in one of the factories I was at, they attempted unionization. And that had to do with the altercation with the HR manager, which led to all the workers kind of coming together. But as you can imagine, it is I mean, in that case, the union never formed in the end, right? The union never formed in the end, because then the management do use a lot of fear tactics. So, although the other important thing in Sri Lanka, and especially now, or not especially now, I would say for the past 30, 40 years, most of our owners of our garment factories are Sri Lankan based capitalists. They are very successful. They're so successful. You find them in India, in Vietnam, in Ethiopia, in Bangladesh, etc. So, you can imagine the surplus accumulation that has led to this kind of them becoming global leaders at it. So what they did was not fear in terms of intimidation, but fear in terms of really work. And this happened during my field work, during that period. Fear in terms of saying we might lose orders. Is this the best thing for the factory? I mean, and I've written about this, right? So, so unionization, no. But during this same period, there were many moments of collective agency that were successful, right? One of which was in 2013, the government tried to change the provident fund scheme, and that was completely kind of, it was organized, but even the organizers didn't see this being such a successful collective effort. And that was primarily young women workers who marched from the free trade zone, one of the free trade zones, one of the most prominent free trade zones, or the first one in Sri Lanka, all the way to Colombo. And this made the government have to retract its bill. It was only a draft bill, and to date, actually, that draft bill hasn't passed, right? Mm-hmm. So there's collective agency. It doesn't necessarily always take the form of unionization. When unionization was attempted, workers were discouraged, but through a lot of persuasion rather than outright violence or outright intimidation. So I think that there are subtleties that we should also pay attention to. So, yeah.
Thanks a lot, Kanchana. Ayşe, do you want to answer the question?
Suraj, and thank you so much for your question. My analysis in the book is based on the workplaces that there were no unionization at all, like there wasn't any unionization attempts either in those workplaces. So I mentioned this fact in my book that like all the social relations on the shop floor, like all like, you know, these like gendered dynamics exist within this like the lack of like any collective organized labor or feminist struggles in those workplaces. And unfortunately, this reflects the general dominant picture of the industry in Turkey. According to the national statistics, like around 9% of the like registered workforce is unionized. And because it only like it is among the registered workers, when we when we think about the fact that like 2/3 of the workforce is unregistered in the garment industry, the real unionization rates drops like much more significantly. But of course, there are unionization attempts. There are unionized workplaces in Turkey in garment workplaces, but unfortunately, there are like very serious and very like at different levels, like from like there are like legal obstacles to the unionization of workers. There are like very harsh like violence that is like different forms of violence that is used by the employers or by the representatives of the employers at workplaces. So like I'm doing my postdoc research on this like organized, like on the nature of collective organized action in the garment industry. I have just finished my fieldwork. I hope to publish articles about it in coming years.
That is great. So it's a glimpse on what happens next for you, Ayşe. I have a question from Bina. Bina, do you want to first, hello, hi, nice to see you. And if you want to unmute yourself simply and ask the question, I think it's the best way forward.
Yeah, sure. Firstly, thank you for such an excellent panel, all three of you. And this contrast between Sri Lanka and Turkey was fascinating, very, very interesting. My question, Ayşe, was that because of this duality that you knew some of the women workers from prior, I was wondering how you maintained the boundaries. Did any of the women ask you to intervene on their behalf if they were facing sexual harassment, or to speak with management for their work conditions to be improved?
Thank you, Vina. Actually, there wasn't any incident of sexual harassment when I was working there with women. They talked about the incidents that had happened before. So they didn't ask me to intervene in like any kind of conflict and, you know, like talk to the management. But there were like very, you know, serious power dynamics and like conflicts among the workers. And like workers, especially in factories, usually act in groups, and they're like sometimes like very hostile, or like, you know, sometimes like only like distant social relations between these groups. And yeah, I had myself experienced like they kind of like tried to take me to their side, and, you know, like to, you know, to have like more power in this way. But I tried to keep my distance like to all groups like equally, as much as I could do. Like I made it always that I wouldn't take anyone's side, because there wasn't like, it wasn't between the management and the workers, but rather like it was about the like the dynamics of competition among the workers. So I tried not to be part of any like these kinds of power struggles.
Thank you.
Thank you. If I may now abuse my position of chair, and I have a final question for Kanchana, then I think perhaps our time is up. I'm not sure. Yes. So it's I always find, as someone that writes on India and the Indian garment industry, the Sri Lankan case so interesting for the role it plays in trying to sort of project an image of ethical production. And it's a lot, and a lot is happening in the field of labor standards in the last 5 years. We have the rise of enforceable buyers agreements, of which, you know, the accord referred to Bangladesh is one of. We also have the rise of due diligence norms. So the direction of travel is against voluntarism, although with sort of its caveats. So I wonder what's next for Sri Lanka, and I think that's perhaps a good way to close the session.
Oh, what's next for Sri Lanka is determined a lot by those tariffs that have been imposed and the turmoil that's causing in the country. So at the moment, the discussions are about how some of these, Sri Lanka is going to be like a design hub, and some of the work is actually going to, it's a point that Gunsuri made. Now this time Sri Lankan capital moving from the country and moving elsewhere with their production shops, right? It's not the legislative things that is bothering the country. What's bothering the country is really, well, two things. One, the tariffs. Three, escalating energy costs and the financial crisis, or the IMF policies requiring market-based pricing, which means energy costs have just escalated in ways that the industry hasn't anticipated. And please note, this is in an industry where some of the industries have gone green, meaning that they use solar power and things like that, right? So the direction of travel at the moment is very uncertain for the country, but more to do with geopolitical or geoeconomic conditions rather than legislative things that's coming out. Yeah.
Thank you. That's such an interesting point to actually make, that sometimes we get embroiled into these discussions about labor standards while the secret to working conditions might actually lie elsewhere.
Well, shall we end then? Okay, we're exactly at the time, so congrats on everyone for keeping the time. It's always thankful for that. So thank you all, moderator, Professor Mezadri, the panelists, and all of you to joining us and being with us today. I know I learned a lot, and I agree with the comment that the perceptions of Turkey and Sri Lanka was really interesting to see together. Please follow IAFFE on social media. Look out for future online events and also the online conference coming in. We also invite you to submit nominations for the 2027 Agarwal Book Prize and find more information we shared with you in the chat. And also registrations are open for the 34th IAFFE conference. Online, it's going to be on 26, 27 of June, and in person in Cali in July from 9 to 11. Thank you all for being with us and have a great day.
Thank you. It was great to be with you.
Thank you to all of you.
Thank you. Thank
IAFFE
you.
staff especially. Super
Thank
appreciate
you.
it. Thank you for being here. Have a
Thank
good
you.
day.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.